My name is Jess from Sallie Tomato, and I'm here today at Riley Blake Designs to show you a bag making tutorial. And I started my business about 8 years ago, and I named my shop after my middle name, Sallie, and inspired by a tomato pincushion for sewing. I'm a big fan of classic movies, and Sallie Tomato is a character from Breakfast at Tiffany's, and I name and design my patterns after classic movie actors. And so this particular pattern, Burkett, perhaps you can guess the name story on that one in the comments, but this is a fun drawstring backpack that is designed for beginners. This is a part of our mini pattern series. So the pattern itself is only one sheet of instructions, and it makes for a really quick, simple project. So the Burkett bag features a drawstring closure with shoulder straps. There's the option to embellish the front with a handmade label. There's a convenient zipper pocket. So this is nice for items that you want easy access to. And I'll also be showing you how to install grommets. So this project only needs 3 different fabrics. So you'll need a main fabric, a lining fabric, and a contrasting fabric. Your contrast fabric should be a non-woven, so either cork fabric or faux leather. And you'll also need either some material to make bias binding or some pre-made bias tape binding, and that will be used for the drawstring straps. So I will be making my own binding ahead of time, but you could use your preferred method to prepare that for the project. Some other supplies that you'll need include a zipper and some hardware. The zipper I'm using is a Sallie Tomato zipper by the yard, which is a roll of zippers that you can cut into whatever length that you need and use for multiple projects. And what's unique about Sallie Tomato zippers is they have a nylon coil, so you can cut and sew over the coil. However, it has a metallic finish, so it can coordinate with your hardware. So I'm using antique hardware, so I have the antique coil zipper. And I've already prepared my zipper ahead of time for this project. You'll need 2 grommets. These grommets are screw together grommets, but there are other styles available. I'll just be showing how to install the screw together grommets, which are very beginner friendly. If you'd like to add a handmade label, there are a variety of fonts available to choose from in different styles. You'll also need a zipper foot for doing top stitching and installing the zipper pocket, and a few basic notions such as sewing clips, pins, a seam ripper, which we'll use for installing the grommets. A safety pin is really helpful for adding the drawstring into the casing. I like to use a turning tool to help smooth out the corners of the seams. You'll need a marking pen, a ruler, cutting tools, and also a screwdriver. So I'm going to clear off some of these supplies, and then we will get started on our project. The first thing we need to work on is assembling the front of the bag. So I've laid out all of my pieces. I have my top panel out of my cotton fabric, my bottom panel out of my non-woven cork fabric, and I have the lining for our zipper pocket. So I've grabbed my zipper that's already prepped, and if you'll notice, the zipper is a little bit longer than our pieces, and that's intentional to help make the installation process a little bit easier. So we're gonna start right away with the zipper, and I've already went ahead and added the zipper pull and cut the length that I need. So you're gonna place the zipper right sides together with the contrasting bottom panel. And now is a great time to decide which direction you want your zipper to open. So if you're right-handed, you'll want your zipper to open towards the right. So I have mine positioned which would be comfortable for me. But if you're left-handed, you'll want to rotate the zipper and have it so the zipper will open towards the left. So I'm going to position it for myself and align the top edge of the bottom panel with the edge of the zipper, and the zipper pull will extend beyond your fabric. So I have it off of the fabric, and you can add some sewing clips to hold the layers together. You'll definitely want to use sewing clips on cork or faux leather because pins can leave a permanent hole in your material. So now we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to attach the zipper to the fabric. And I just have a standard foot on my machine, but we can swap over to a zipper foot. And this will help sew close to the zipper coil and maintain our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So make sure to back stitch at the beginning. Next, take one of your lining pocket pieces and align the top edge and make sure the side edges are even with your bottom panel. And again, add some clips to hold the layers together. And now we're going to sew the lining in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you're an experienced bag maker, you could certainly layer the zipper and the lining all at one time versus having those 2 stitch lines. But for beginners, I find it's helpful to stitch the zipper on first so you don't have to worry about managing 3 layers at a time while sewing the seam. So let's head over to the machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So next you're going to press the lining away from the zipper, and we can take this over to the iron and press the lining fabric. If you're using cork fabric and your iron accidentally touches the cork, that's okay. You can iron cork, but you cannot iron faux leather. So if you decide to use faux leather for this project, you cannot touch the iron to it. Cork fabric and faux leather don't hold a crease very well, so we are just going to finger press the cork away from the zipper. Or if you have a seam roller, you could use that. Just making sure that your lining and your bottom panel are wrong sides together, and the zipper is along the top edge of the seam. Then we'll top stitch an 1/8 inch from the seam. So here's what your project should look like so far. And next we'll attach the other half of the lining for our pocket. This time you're going to align the top edge of the lining with the top edge of the zipper, and make sure that your side edges are even and sew together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we'll add the top panel of the bag. So you'll position the top panel right sides together with your zipper and the attached bottom panel. Align those top raw edges and the side edges and sew together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then we'll press the top panel away from the zipper. And I like to fold the top panel away from the zipper so that way the seam allowance stays pressed towards the top panel and the zipper tape stays flat. So that just has a nice flat finish and disperses the bulk of the seams. Then similar to the lower half of the front panel, we'll top stitch an 1/8 inch from the seam on our top panel. And next we're going to close the bottom edges of the lining for our pocket. So we're going to fold away the bottom panel and sew together along the bottom raw edges of our lining fabric. But first I'm going to swap my foot back out to my standard foot because we no longer need the zipper foot. So next we're going to attach the lining to the base of the bag because the side edges aren't attached to the front panel at all. So first of all, slide your zipper pull to the inside of the project, away from the side edges, and then make sure that your lining fabric is flat, and we're going to top stitch a 1/4 inch along each of the side edges, starting at the top seam and sewing down to the bottom edge of the lining. And it's always a good idea to backstitch for reinforcement. And then rotate your project so we can sew the other side. Next, we'll trim off that excess zipper tape and make sure that our panel measures according to the finished size of the pattern. And just trim off that excess zipper and the edge of the lining fabric that was peeking through. You can throw that scrap away. Now is also a great time to add a handmade label to the front of your bag if you would like. So I'm going to grab the hardware and show you how to install it. So I've already went ahead and installed a handmade label on a front panel that I've prepared earlier. And it's really fun to coordinate the hardware with your zipper coil. There are several different fonts to choose from for handmade labels, and it only takes a few extra steps to install one into your bag project and add that nice handmade touch to your project. And you can position the handmade label wherever you would like on your bag. I recommend to install it centered 1 inch up from the zipper seam. However, if you want it in a lower corner or at the top, it's completely up to you. So I'm going to mark the center of my bag. Okay. And mark the center. Then I'm going to take the washer and center it over the placement mark and mark each of the slits for the prongs. You can use a small scissors to cut the slits, but I'm going to use a seam ripper. So you'll poke the seam ripper through at the bottom edge of the slit mark and cut towards the top. If you're worried about cutting past the top edge of the mark, one tip is to take a pin and add it at the top of the slit. So when you start cutting with your seam ripper will stop once it hits the pin. So that way you don't cut past, which is really helpful. Then you can take your hardware and poke the prongs through from the right side to the wrong side. Then you'll flip your project over so the wrong side is facing up. and place your washer over the prongs, and I recommend to bend the prongs away from the center to help distribute some of the bulk of the hardware. And if you have any scraps of fusible interfacing, then you can cut a piece that is generously larger than your hardware and fuse it over the wrong side of your hardware. And this will help protect your lining fabric from getting scratched and from use over time from using your backpack. So I've already completed this step and have my front panel complete with the handmade label and the extra interfacing. So you can set the front panel aside, and next we'll work on preparing the back panel of the bag. So I've already prepared my back panel, but I'm going to walk you through the steps on how to assemble it. It's very similar to the steps before when we attached the zipper. However, this time we won't have a zipper. So all you'll need to do is to take your top panel and place it right sides together with your bottom panel. Sew the two pieces together with 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then you'll press the top away from the bottom, so that way your seam allowance is towards the top edge of the bag, and your cork fabric and your faux leather is flat. And then you will top stitch with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So here is what the finished panel will look like from the right side and the wrong side once you have the two pieces attached. So once your back panel is prepped, you can set this piece aside and we will work on the drawstring casing. So I'm going to move this off to the side and grab my casing pieces. There are two pieces for your casing, and you'll want to press each of the ends 3/4 of an inch to the wrong side twice. So over here at the iron, can take a ruler and fold the end over 3/4 of an inch. And if you have a hot hammer, you can use that as well. So give that first fold a press. And then for the second fold, if you fold along the raw edge, that will be 3/4 of an inch. And then you'll repeat for the opposite end as well as the other casing piece. So once you have each of your pieces pressed, then you'll take it over to the sewing machine and top stitch 1/4 inch from each of the folded edges. So the very outer folded edge as well as the inner folded edge on each end of the casing. And you'll repeat for both of your casing pieces. Then you'll fold the casing in half with wrong sides together. So whichever side that you folded the casing to, I'm using a batik, so just note that the side with the fold is the wrong side. So you'll press that in half lengthwise. Just make sure those raw edges are aligned. And repeat for the other casing. And now we're ready to start assembling our bag. So I'm going to set aside my extra pieces and grab my front and back panel. So I've grabbed my front and back panel and also an extra spool of thread. And we're going to use the spool of thread to help shape the bottom corners of the bag. So the casing can be set aside for the moment, and we'll start with the front panel. So take just a standard spool of thread, preferably a larger spool versus a smaller spool, and align it in each of the bottom corners so that way the outer edge of the spool is even with the raw edge of your fabric. And also align the bottom edges. Then you'll take a marking pen and trace the curved edge from raw edge to raw edge. And then we'll repeat for the opposite side of the base, making sure that the spool is aligned with each of those raw edges of the fabric. Then you'll take a scissors and just cut along that curved mark. And we'll repeat for the back panel. And to save a little bit of extra steps, you can certainly use your front panel as a template to trace that curved edge versus aligning the spool again. So I'm just going to line up those raw edges and trace the already cut edge of my front panel. So now we'll attach one casing to the front and one casing to the back. So you'll align the raw edges of the casing along the top edge of one of your exterior panels, making sure that there's an even amount of fabric on either side of the casing. So you'll want the material centered. Add a few sewing clips or pins to hold the layers together. And we'll attach our other casing right away to the front panel. Then over at the machine, we'll sew the casing in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And make sure to backstitch. Backstitch at the end as well. And repeat for the other casing. All right, looks good. This is really coming along. So now we're ready to assemble the exterior. So you'll place your front and back panels right sides together. Make sure the sides and the bottom edges are even, as well as the top. Add sewing clips around the outer edges to hold the layers together. And depending on the type of zipper that you used, you may have to trim either the front or the back panel so it is even with the other side. Then we'll sew the sides and bottom edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So start at the very top edge, sew down the side around the bottom and back up to the opposite side edge. As you're sewing around the curves, you can lift up your presser foot and pivot slightly, sew a few more stitches, and pivot again as needed so that way you have a smooth seam allowance around the curved edge. We are going to leave the exterior wrong side out, and I'm going to grab the lining pieces to put those together before the final assembly. So you can set aside your exterior. I'm going to grab the lining. And I've already went ahead and prepped some of my lining pieces. I'll explain to you how they go together. So you'll want to align all edges of your lining, and I've added some pins to hold the layers together. And you're going to start at the top edge of your bag. So if this is the top edge here, you'll start with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and as you sew down the side seam, you'll gradually increase the seam allowance to a 1/2 inch. Then you'll continue with a 1/2 inch all the way down the side around the bottom, and make sure to leave about 4 inches unsewn along the bottom. So you'll stop sewing, do your back stitching, leave the opening, and start again. Also, before you sew, you'll want to mark those curved corners along the bottom just as before, so that way it matches the front. So then you'll continue up the other side edge and gradually decrease your seam allowance back down to 1/4 of an inch as you reach the opposite side edge. So here is what the lining looks like complete. And I've left that turning opening in the bottom edge of the lining like I'd mentioned. So now we can trim some of the excess lining. So the seam allowance measures 1/4 inch wide to help reduce some of the bulk. Once you reach the area where you left the turning opening, you'll want to leave the full width of the seam allowance. So I stop cutting right where the stitching ended and then cut a vertical line so that way I have the full length of the fabric for my seam allowance. That will be easier for closing the turning opening later on. I'm going to toss these scraps and clean up these clips a little bit. Now you can turn the lining so it faces right side out. And insert the lining inside the exterior. Next, you'll want to align the side seams. So make sure those match. And at each of the side seams, I like to nest the seam allowances. So that just means to press the top seam in one direction and the bottom seam in the opposite direction. So that way the bulk of the seam allowances is evenly distributed. And you can pin all the way around the top or use sewing clips. I usually like to pin directly at the side seams so each of the seam allowances will lay flat. So match up the opposite side seam. And then work on aligning all of the top edges so they are even. Once you have all of your pins added around the top edge, you'll sew around the entire top edge of the bag with 3/8 inch seam allowance. I like to use my needle plate as a guide to help maintain my seam allowance and find the 3/8 inch on the needle plate versus trying to adjust my foot or my needle at all. And make sure to back stitch. And now we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So reach in and grab your lining and pull that out. And then through the turning opening, you'll push your contrasting base through first because that's the thickest part of the bag, and use your thumbs to work the rest of the fabric through. So if you need to, you can reach in and push out the seams so that way they're right along the edge. You have a nice folded edge along the outer edges of your bag. And I like to use a turning tool to help smooth out the corners. You can also use your fingers to help roll the seam flat. Then we'll sew the turning opening closed. So position your lining fabric so the raw edges are turned towards the wrong side of your fabric towards the inside. And you'll want to align those folded edges, add a few pins to hold the layers together and keep them even. And then over at the machine, you'll sew with an 1/8 inch seam allowance to close the turning opening. And you can start and stop where the previous stitching had ended. I always find it's fast and easy to sew it at the machine, but if you prefer to hand stitch the turning opening closed, you can certainly do that as well using your preferred technique. Then you can push the lining down into the exterior and arrange it in place. You'll want to make sure the casing is pulled to the top at the very top edge of your bag. I'm just going to arrange the lining into place, and now we'll top stitch all the way around the top edge of the bag with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can start at any point on the bag. I usually like to start on the back so the back stitches are hidden against the back side. And here's what the top edge looks like with the top stitching all the way around. The bag itself is complete, and next we'll create the drawstring and attach the grommets to complete the shoulder straps. So I'm going to grab my pieces. You'll need 2 grommets for this project. Usually when you get grommets in an entire set, you'll have a few extras, so I've already taken out the ones that I need. The grommets have 2 sides to them. We have the front plate and the back plate with the screws. I've already went ahead and disassembled each of the grommets into both halves and have my screws on my work surface. What's nice about having a little piece of fleece is the screws tend to stick to the fleece. Otherwise, you could take a piece of tape and add it to your cutting mat and then adhere each of the little screws onto the piece of tape so that way they don't roll away while you're working. So the hardware will install into the bottom corners of the bag, but first of all, let's work on the drawstring itself. You'll want to use either pre-made bias tape or create your own bias tape. And I've already went ahead and created my own bias tape, so you can use your favorite method for creating that. So you have your continuous length of bias, 1 for each strap. And with your bias tape, you'll want to unfold the beginning and then press a 1/2 inch of the fabric towards the wrong side. And I've already went ahead and done that. Then you'll refold and press the bias tape again, so that way you don't have a raw edge on the end of your bias tape. Then you'll repeat the same step for the opposite end of your bias tape as well as your other strap. After that, you'll fold the bias tape in half so the raw edges are encased in the center. And we'll top stitch an 1/8 inch from all edges of the bias tape. So we'll close off that short end as well as each of the length sides, so that way the folds stay in place. And as you reach the short edge, pivot, sew across, and down the opposite side. right, so you'll repeat the same steps to create a second drawstring piece. Then we'll guide it through our casing. So start with one of your drawstrings, and I find it very helpful to attach a safety pin to the beginning end of your drawstring, and this will help feed it through each of the casings. So have the front of your bag right side up and feed the end with the safety pin into the casing and push the fabric over the safety pin and then pull the fabric over the drawstring. And continue that process of pushing the fabric over the safety pin, pull the fabric over the drawstring all the way across, making sure that the drawstring doesn't twist. And I'm feeding this through from the right-hand side of the bag to the left. So now we're going to feed it through the back casing from the left-hand side towards the right. So we're just going to loop around. I'm going to get it started and then flip the bag over. Then you can pull some more of the drawstring through, so that way the ends of your drawstring are even. So you have an even amount of fabric coming through on each end. Then I'm going to remove the safety pin and attach it to the remaining drawstring. I'm going to flip the project over. And this time we're going to feed the drawstring through on the left-hand side towards the right and then loop it back around. All right, so got it through the front, and then we'll feed it through the back. So then you'll want to make sure that the ends of this opposite drawstring are also even. And we can remove the safety pin. Now we'll install the grommets in each of the bottom corners. So you'll want to take the back plate that has the screw holes, and I'm going to make sure that the raw edges, or the seamed edges, are right along the very edge. So I'm just going to roll the fabric to have a nice smooth curved edge. You also want to make sure that the lining fabric inside is face down, and it should be away from the corner as well. So just make sure it's out of the way on the inside. Then you're going to take your grommet back plate and position it in the corner of your bag. You'll want about 1/2 inch of your fabric around either side of the grommet. And you can use a pen or some chalk and mark that inner circle as well as each of the screw holes. And I'm going to mark the opposite corner at the same time. And before cutting, I like to mark around the placement for each of the screw holes and the opening, so that way we know exactly where we're supposed to be cutting. So instead of cutting the exact size of the center hole of our grommet, we need to cut a little bit past as well as into the screw holes. So I like to draw an oval shape around the screw holes and about 1/8 inch past the circle, so that way we trim enough fabric away so it doesn't peek through the opening of the grommet. And we'll repeat for the opposite side. So just draw an oval to connect each of the screw holes and about 1/8 inch past that circle opening. Then you can take a seam ripper to help get this cut started, and you'll want to cut through both layers, the front and the back, at the same time. So just poke it through your fabrics, cut a slit, then take your scissors and follow along that oval that you traced. And I know that this can be a little intimidating cutting into your finished project, so just make sure you take your time to mark that oval shape, and you can always cut more if needed. So if you're nervous, you can cut smaller, and you can always go back and trim off a little bit extra. And then we'll cut out the other opening. And it may not look pretty now, but it'll look pretty in a minute. So next we'll attach the grommets. So you'll have your front plate centered over the oval. And this is a good test as well to double check if you have enough material cut away. If you flip it over to the wrong side, and notice if your screw holes both show through the opening. So I do need to cut away a little bit extra. And that looks good. Then you'll take your back plate and make sure the screw holes are all aligned, and grab your screws and screw the hardware together. And if you'd like, I always recommend adding some permanent glue to the inside of the grommet pieces before screwing together, just to make sure that they stay put after installing. I haven't had an issue with the screws coming loose at all, but it's always just a nice precaution to have that peace of mind that it won't come apart. So here is what our finished grommet looks like. And then we'll repeat for the opposite corner. All right, so we have both grommets installed. I'm gonna re-zip that, and I'm gonna move away a few things before we finish up the drawstring. All right, so take one side of your drawstring, making sure the ends are even, and guide it through the adjacent grommet from the front side to the back side. And then you're going to tie the end of the drawstring into a knot. And I usually like to double knot it just to make sure that it's not gonna come through that grommet. And then we'll repeat for the opposite side. And then to cinch your drawstring closed, all you have to do is pull on both of the straps, and your bag is ready to use. I think this turned out so cute. I hope that you'll try out the Burkett pattern. We've added a link in the description to the pattern. And if you decide to make this project, make sure to use the hashtag Sallie Tomato so you can show it off and we can see it. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and until next time, have a creative day. Bye.